Recording now, please. Okay. It is such a delight to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Vanessa. Let me tell you a little bit about her before she comes up here. Dr. Vanessa Gomez Brake is the Senior Associate Dean of Religious Life at the University of Southern California. She is the first humanist chaplain to serve in this capacity in any American university. Yay! In her role, she works to support and promote university, religious, and spiritual life broadly conceived, and helps oversee more than 90 student religious groups and 50 religious directors on campus. She also serves as an advisor to the USC Interfaith Council and the Secular Student Fellowship. Previously, Vanessa worked at Stanford University's Office of Religious Life, where she led campus programming and worked closely with student-led religious groups. And at Stanford, she organized ceremonies, events, programs, worship services at the historic Stanford Memorial Church and Circle, which stands for Center for Interreligious Community Learning and Experiences. Additionally, she played a supporting role at the Windover Contemplative Center and the campus-wide series Contemplation by Design. Now, it gets even more interesting because Vanessa is an accomplished Filipino folk dancer and multi-instrumentalist. She performed at the White House and Carnegie Hall for Filipino American History Month celebrations, and her folk artistry is an extension of her interfaith work, as her performances showcase the diverse traditions, rituals, and beliefs of Muslim, Christians, and indigenous peoples of the Philippines. I think I could go on. Google her. I just want to say that I met Vanessa because she received a certificate in Humanist Studies and Leadership from what was known as the Humanist Institute, the former Humanist Institute. It is now the Center for Education under the umbrella of the American Humanist Association, and Vanessa is on the board of the AHA and is also one of the faculty and on the advisory council, so a lot going on there. Okay, let's leave them to research the rest later, and I'm going to invite you up here. We have some chairs, and we'll get the microphones ready, and we're going to have an interview, a conversation. So I think you will use this one. All right.
Is this good?
And I will, I think maybe I'll use this one. Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Is this work?
Hopefully.
Okay.
Folks online, hopefully you can
And
hear
this
me
is
too.
not on, or is it? It is on. Okay, great. Okay, great. So I want to make sure that all of you can see us and everybody on Zoom can mostly see Vanessa. Okay. Why don't we start with an origin story? We've been together this weekend, so we've got sort of gone over some questions and things that we might want to talk about. But I often like to hear how all of you found your way through this door at the Brooklyn Society, Brooklyn Ethical. And so I'm always interested to hear how other people, found their way to humanism. You not only found your way, but you're now one of our leaders. So tell us that story, please.
Yeah. When you say origin story, you think superheroes, Marvel, and I was just like, well, was it that exciting? I was not bit by a spider or any such origin, but perhaps what I can tell you is that I'm Filipino American, and I was raised in Arizona and Guam, and all I ever really knew was the Catholic tradition. But by the time I got to college, I was very curious about these other religions, because think about Guam and the Philippines, it's very Roman Catholic, right? So when I came to Arizona State University, I was meeting Jewish people, Muslim folks, Baha'i folks, Buddhists, and it was just blowing my mind that there were so many ways that humans come to understand their world. And I was taking a women and religions course, and I remember at the time, every student was like, oh, I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist. And then one of my classmates said she was a humanist. And I was like, well, what in the world is that? And so from that point on, yeah, I was still a feminist and I was a humanist, but it was probably a decade later that I learned that ethical culture societies existed, that there were all sorts of humanist communities gathering like-minded people to be in community. And that again blew me away. And so the program that you just talked about in terms of the Humanist Institute, where I got my certificate in humanist leadership, I was living in Oakland, California, and I had to travel to DC and New York in order to learn the history of these traditions. And that was me doing a deep dive into humanism once I learned that these communities had existed, for hundreds of years here in the US and beyond. And so that was me just really wanting to find my people. And so, as you can see, I've stuck around.
So yes, not only did you stick around, but you took on these leadership roles. So it's one thing to recognize that your philosophy, your life stance is in alignment with humanism. It's quite another to make that kind of a commitment where you say, I'm going to stand up for humanism, I'm going to represent humanism, and I'm going to play this role.
Yeah.
So, and again, you are the first one to play a role in an American university. There are a few of us chaplains out there, but you made it to the big time.
I guess so. So when I was in college, because I was studying religion and psychology, I started doing interfaith dialogue. And I had this experience of, it's what we call deficit thinking. Like people thought that an atheist or a secular humanist didn't have any tradition or values to ground themselves in. And we know that couldn't be any further from the truth, right? And so I think by going to the Humanist Institute and by eventually becoming a chaplain, this was my way of just saying, we're out here. And we have a breadth of values and histories that should be known. And I really hated, and I think another term you've probably heard is theonormativity, right? There's so much normativity around the belief in a God or gods in our American society that it often made me feel on the outside of things. And so I just really wanted to change that. And maybe I was just an angsty young adult or something, but I was just like, I'm here too. And I knew there was more people like me, and we know that. So much research has showed us, especially now, that there are a ton of folks out there who are unaffiliated, and we know that word means a lot of different things, but that there's so many folks who do not believe in a God, and they are good people doing good things, right, in different ways. And I think I really wanted a role model for myself, which is why you've been a great mentor all these many years. And I just think we need to speak out more. And so that's why I was drawn to humanist leadership, because I needed it for myself as well.
We were talking about how you found your place on the college campus.
Yep.
So we're talking about academia. I shared with you an anecdote that came up for me when I was a chaplain. I was a chaplain originally at Adelphi University in Garden City, Long Island, and then at Columbia and NYU in Manhattan. And kind of an anecdote that speaks to stereotypes and the way that young students coming into a new setting may think or feel about things is sort of the roommates who discover, oh, you're a Christian? And I thought you were smart. Oh, you're an atheist? And I thought you were a good person. And so that's very stereotypical, but that takes place on campuses. And, we're involved in different kinds of communities on the campus. One is amongst our colleagues who are also chaplains. And by the way, it's wonderful if you are paid staff of a university, but the chaplains, which are also called religious life advisors at Columbia, spiritual life advisors at NYU, are not paid by the university, they're paid by their denomination. So a lot of them do fundraising. I was fortunate at the New York Society that work was included in my contract. And other clergy people can make that arrangement. Others, not so much, and they spend their vacations fundraising for that, so they can stay in that position. So there's that community of your colleagues, and then of course there's the community of the students. And some universities will gather data so that they know that they are unaffiliated or NONES nuns. Others, like Columbia, refuse to do that, and yet we know they're there. So can you speak to a little bit about sort of the demographics? And I know that things have changed over the decades, where there used to be an assumption that, oh, universities, they're just secular, we're just going to treat them. And then there was a realization that, no, our students are coming in with something, and we need to honor and respect that and help to meet that need. So you've been on sort of like working on a lot of that.
Yeah. So recently I finished my dissertation last year, which tended to focus on Christian hegemony in higher education. That means Christian dominance. And it is interesting how so often people refer to universities or colleges as these secular havens, right? Which certainly it is. We were talking earlier how if atheists have a sacred space, it's probably a university or a library, because it's where knowledge resides, where you can engage deep conversations. But at a secular university, there's sort of this false secularism, because all of our institutions have a history grounded in a Christian affiliation, whether it's Harvard Congregationalist, Yale, Georgetown Catholic. Most all universities in the US started from a particular Christian perspective. And although we've become secular over a couple hundred years since those institutions were started, that Christian privilege has lived on through the systems, the processes, and the privileges, literal privileges that Christians still get to enjoy to this day. And so as I was thinking about that and doing my research, I wanted to identify how it lives out today. And so you talked about me being one of the only humanist chaplains who's actually paid full time. And it's not necessarily to be a humanist chaplain, though I do that, but it's to provide oversight for religious life on my campus. And so I wanted to speak to the one question you had embedded in there, was that why aren't there more humanist chaplains on our universities? When you think about the history of our universities being Christian, and that Christian institutions have thousands of years in funding, right, built up to support such roles on campus. Whereas our volunteers as humanists and ethical culture leaders, they have less funding available to them to be of service in this way on these campuses. And so it's just a different form of privilege, right? And so that's why it's pretty difficult, because my colleagues at these other universities who are really volunteering as affiliates, they have to be doing the fundraising, which is something I do fundraising in different ways, but not for my position, right? For me to be there. Luckily, I have the privilege of just being paid to do the oversight piece, right? So I think I spoke to a couple questions in there. What was there an overarching, or did I miss it?
No, I'm going to segue to something else, though. Another thing that we were talking about in terms of meeting the needs of students, and we're particularly feeling it now because we are once again, 4 years later, we're back in a place that we didn't want to be again, but we are, in terms of the vulnerability of students, of many populations, but in your case, students. And so whether it's, you talked about a sacred space, one aspect of a sacred space is a sanctuary. And so being aware that there are students now who are extremely vulnerable, not only because of their immigration status, but also because of their identity, gender, sexual identity. I was sharing a story at NYU where we had our LGBTQIA department giving a program for us religious spiritual life advisors and giving us a case study. And so we were breaking into breakout groups talking about it. one of my Christian colleagues used the language that they use often, and that is, well, you know, in this case, I would just remind the student that we hate the sin, but we love the sinner. And I went, oh, no, no. And so it speaks to that Christian hegemony, but also a kind of a pastoral care that works together with mental health and counseling resources on the campus. So in this particular case, I sort of called it, I didn't call him out personally, but I called out what he said to the larger group, because my concern was a student going to that individual for pastoral care might be harmed. And so a reminder that there's also counseling service, mental health services, and I know that your department, what you do, works together with them. It's a very important partnership that you have. So if you could speak to that kind of partnership and sort of protecting, caring, nurturing for the students, and then that would be a nice segue into spirituality that we talked about before.
Sure thing. Yeah. Yeah, it's a scary time actually to work in higher education. I'm sure you've read the headlines in the past 2 weeks. Higher education is under attack. And even before Trump returned to office, one of our programs at the University of Southern California, in my office, Religious and Spiritual Life, is we call it queertuality. So it's spirituality for our queer students, LGBTQIA, 2S, all of that. It was interesting because this is a program we've had for a long time under different names and so forth, recognizing that many folks within this community have been experienced religious trauma. And you are sharing how there's even this guise of niceties of religious groups who aren't truly recognizing and welcoming the whole human. But our program has always been about welcoming everyone in. And so we partner with our LGBT center at USC. And because we're a private university, we will maintain that LGBT center. But the program doesn't meet at the religious center because, again, those who have experienced religious trauma may not feel welcome there, even if we tell them they're welcome there. And so we take it over to the student union where students can feel really comfortable. So I wanted to raise this up because before Trump came into office, I think it was last year sometime, one of these sort of watchdog conservative, what is it, the Leadership Institute? They have a student-run website called Campus Reform. And so these conservative students are looking for, I wrote it down here, leftist bias and abuse on higher ed campuses. And they identified our program as being one such program. And it was weird because they literally just copied and pasted everything from our website. But if you go to this Campus Reform website, it's pointing out anything that's diversity, equity, inclusion, folks that are supportive of transgender people, folks who are supportive of queer folks. And so they're not saying anything necessarily about the program, but they're waving a flag saying, these people are here, they're in this institution. And it's scary. And so that's part of the work as a chaplain on campus is making sure everyone feels welcome. And even if they're not religious or spiritual, supporting them in their meaning-making path, whatever that may look like. And so, yeah, that's just one example of some of the scary times we're having right now.
Use the expression meaning-making.
Yeah.
And I often like to use that we human beings are a meaning-making species, and that is a component of spirituality. And I wanted you to speak to that a little bit because it takes, of course, many different forms on your campus, but also students may come in with a certain sensibility about it, and they may leave with something different. And also, I know for some humanists, for some ethnoculturists, the very word spirituality can be triggering, as can the word religion. And so we're very aware of language and vocabulary and how when we use these terms, it's important to put it in a certain context and to understand what we mean by that. So I'm wondering if you can sort of help to maybe unpack maybe what you personally mean by spirituality, how that's expressed on your campus, how different students meet that and maybe use that as a tool for meaning making, and how it might change throughout their career on campus.
That's a great question, and it reminds me of something else you touched on previously, so I'm glad to come back to it. One of the common terminologies we use on higher ed campuses is RSSI, religious, spiritual, and secular identities. And that's just how we term sort of our programs, so that people know it's for everyone. Because think about it, a lot of people organize under the word religion, but not everyone does. A lot of people organize under spirituality, but not everyone does. And then we have the secular, like my secular student fellowship. And so earlier you talked about how some universities do demographics so that they know who they have. That way, perhaps they can make informed decisions on the programs or what sort of staff time will be put toward a certain group of people. But at the University of Southern California, we recognize that everyone is on a meaning-making path. And so our programming is for everyone, whether you identify with a religious identity or not. And so we try to make it so that our programs are so expansive that anyone can really see themselves coming to it. And that's, although I don't necessarily like the word spirituality sometimes, I don't believe in spirits per se, I understand what they're getting at, and I think it is the language of our time right now. Just like the word interfaith isn't perfect because not everyone has faith, spirituality isn't perfect either because not everyone believes in spirits. But if I could tell you a bit about spiritual care, so I'm a spiritual care provider on my campus, and I see everyone, the religious, the spiritual, the secular, the I don't knows sort of folks, right? And do you know what I do in spiritual care? I have deep, meaningful conversations. Sometimes students are grieving. Other times they've had a breakup, right? And they need someone to process with. Others come to an elite university like USC and they have a traumatic sort of life crisis because they've always been that A student and suddenly they got a B. You know, it's young adult stuff, but it's also big world stuff. They're having to engage with what's going on in this nation as well. And so they have existential crisis issues, right? And I'm having to navigate these crises with them. And truly, I know I'm the care provider, but I feel like I'm also being cared for, that students are willing to engage with me in these subjects that are meaningful to them. And so on this topic of spiritual care, I also just wanted to lift up our faculty as well, because as much as I am there for the students, in the last few years, I've seen quite a few faculty and staff members coming to me as well. Again, I said it's scary to work at a university these days because, for example, last spring when we had protests on campus, there were some faculty out there who were supporting the protests. And then LAPD was called to campus and some of our students were arrested. And so the question for some of these faculty and staff members is it's the moral injury piece of it. It's how can I be in service to an institution that is really going against my basic values, right? And so they're having a crisis as well. And so while I was the chaplain, I was on the ground, I was observing all the protests and everything going on, but there's a bigger crisis on campus because folks are losing trust in the institution and losing trust in each other and their colleagues. And so all of that is spiritual care. And so I'll continue using that word, even though I recognize it can be a barrier as well.
You use the word trust, and when you were speaking about the students who come to you and have the conversation with you, and that level of trust, and I think some students came to me and perhaps came to you as well, but because maybe they didn't trust the counseling center. Oh, I don't need therapy. Or maybe in their family of origin, there was some, you don't do that, So this is a way for them to have that experience with a different name to it.
Yeah, and thank you for that reminder, because we do partner with our counseling and mental health department pretty regularly. We recognize that not everyone is going to go to counseling. I'm an Asian American, and we know that the numbers of Asian Americans who actually seek out counseling and mental health services is greatly reduced as compared to other groups and ethnicities. And so if a student is more comfortable coming to a religious leader than they are to a mental health provider, then we're going to be there for them. But I can also help facilitate a handoff, right? Or even supporting them in seeking mental health support when it's clear that I'm not the professional that's going to help them, because I'm aware that I can't do everything and I'm not trained in a particular way. And so I really do want to get students to counseling when I recognize their problems are beyond my skill set.
Sometimes I think of us as a bridge, because in my pastoral counseling training, we said refer, refer, refer. I mean, you're listening, obviously, and if not making a diagnosis, you're at least coming to an understanding. As one of my teachers says, you're listening to where it pinches. And so you're listening for that, and then you can be that bridge. And I know some denominations actually put a limited number of pastoral counseling visits before you refer. I had a colleague who was an Episcopalian priest, and he said it was either 3 or 5, at which point you had to hand them off. And I said, well, again, I understand the policy or the guideline behind it, but you have to also be pragmatic about that, but kind of that bridge. Yeah.
Well, and how interesting too. I think our students are limited to like 6 sessions at the counseling center. So I don't necessarily have a limit. I'm not going to see a student every day, whatever, but I have regulars that I see every other week, to check in on a particular subject that I know has been challenging them, right? And then at some point, yeah, they graduate, right? They go on. Well, they literally graduate, but they graduate from that issue maybe, right? But perhaps they get so used to having someone care for them in that way that, they realize that they can bring other issues up in that space. And so as a spiritual care provider, I am also a confidential counselor, which means anything that is shared with me in that space will not be shared outside. Yeah. Except for, violence towards oneself and others. That is the occasion where I will intervene. But otherwise, it's meant to be a safe space.
And we tell them that up front, that if you are harm to yourself or someone else. So I also know that you do a lot of fun things. So one of the times, so we've done programs together at the Parliament of the World's Religions, and the last time I saw you at a Parliament, you were talking about a lot of the fun things. So talk about some of the events, the programs, just the sheer joyous, fun things that you do.
It is college after all. You should be having fun. And what's funny? These students, and again, I think it's because it's like in an elite university, we only accept about 10% of those who apply. And so a lot of these students are so driven, they forget to have fun. They're overscheduled. They are anxious about their grades and what career they're going to have. They forget to be in the present with each other and with themselves. And so some of the fun stuff we do is to sort of, just mix it up. And so that at the religious center, like they can just be themselves and do something other than thinking about the future, right? And so right before I traveled here to the East Coast, on our third or final Thursdays, we do hug-a-pug sessions, which we literally bring pugs to the center courtyard of the building. I bring mine because I have 2 rescue pugs, and anyhow, they are not therapy dogs. But pugs do provide care in other ways because they're so personable, right? And so think about this. There are so many people who love dogs out there, right? We used to have therapy cats that would come as well, so we'd have a good mix for, dog and cat people. But consider this. These young adults these days, they don't even know how to make friends. They've lost their social abilities, right? And there's many reasons for that. But pugs will disarm you, right? And suddenly you're hanging out with another student next to you who also loves pugs and is having this magical experience with a pug. And so these fun programs are actually friendship making programs. People are meeting each other for the first time, and they might not share a major. They're so used to being in a classroom with people who share their major, but now they just know someone who likes dogs and, having goofy fun. And so we're friendship making, and that very much is a priority. We know that loneliness is an epidemic here. On college campuses, in our nation, in the world. And so if I can facilitate friendships, then that's a success. And so Hug a Pug is one example of what we're doing at the Religious Center.
I imagine, as I experience on my campuses too, there's a lot of eating going on.
Yeah.
So is there something special around the menus or the eating?
Yeah, so we have a program on Tuesdays where anyone who's hungry can come and eat. And usually we get anywhere from 200 to 300 students to come and eat. And you know what we do, much like yourselves, we make it vegan. So it's pretty healthy, and it's good for you, and it's free. And so the students come in, they get to eat, and then because it's LA and we usually always have good weather, we're in the courtyard. And then, much like ourselves, we do a Jubilee stage is what we call it, so that we already have people eating in the courtyard. And then we get students to perform for students in front of a live audience. So we've had comedians and improv groups, but also musicians, aspiring musicians and performers. And at the Hollywood school that is USC, we've got so much talent. And so it's been a lot of fun just highlighting the rich, talents of our Trojan community.
The free meal is so important. I think maybe you don't realize, maybe you do realize, but it was kind of shocking to me how many students don't eat enough, that they're not on the meal plan or they can't afford it. And this is real. Students on campuses across the country are hungry. And so to offer the free meal, and getting back to the Parliament, one of the many things that I think we love about the Parliament is the Sikh community always offers, what's it called, the Langar. They always offer a free meal, a vegan meal, and just how important it is to feed people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know college students are always hungry. Like, they're always looking for a free meal. But on our campus, LA, we've got every type of student there. And there are houseless students as well, living in their cars, right? Or couch surfing. They're putting all their money into their education so that they can aspire to a career that will take care of themselves and their families. But food, basic human needs, are not being met for our students. And so this is just one way that we can feed those who are hungry, but also create community for them as well. And so sadly, I think a lot of our hungry students are also international students. And so they're being supported by their families to come abroad to get a college education, which it means a lot to have an American higher education. But they don't have the money to meet their basic needs. And so we also encourage students to bring their containers, their to-go containers, so that they can have another meal later. So we're cooking a lot of food.
I have two final questions before I open it up to all of you for Q&A. One is, what do you want to tell us about ways that we can support you? And then secondly, what's on your list that you want to talk about that I haven't asked you yet? And then when you answer those, then I'll open it up to Q&A.
Sure. And truthfully, I feel so well supported, but as you heard, I'm the only humanist chaplain that is fully a full-time staff administrator. And so I would ask that the Ethical Culture Society continue to support ethical culture leaders and those going into university campuses, because I am alone. There's not a lot of secular leadership in at least the religious life sort of bubble. And I can only break down so many walls, right? And so I need support from my communities as well, as do all our humanist chaplains. And just in any way you can, really, whether it's financial, programmatically, supporting the students in their groups, community groups as well, just really celebrate the work and support them. I don't know. We had such a fun discussion, truthfully, because of everything that's happening with this new presidential administration. I had a long list of really upsetting things that we could have talked about, but I think we probably had enough of that. And so, yeah, that was, I'm looking at my list, and it was all like the really gloomy things. So let's
Okay,
open it up.
Great, so Tachi, I'm going to give this to you if anybody has a question here. And Pat, you'll keep an eye on anybody raising their hand on Zoom.
I got first here. You said that was closer. Anyway, I just wondered because, you know, you're talking about, and you work at a private university, and I guess Anne you were at Columbia.
They're both private, yeah.
Yeah, right. That's one of the schools I went to. As well as Cornell. That's a little confusing about whether it's public or private or halfway or something. But anyway, but I just wondered whether public, you know, the state-run state universities are different in the way they operate in terms of, you know, spiritual life.
And this may sound weird coming from an atheist to say it's too bad public institutions don't do religion, but it's a DEI issue, right? Think about our Muslim students over at UCLA, a public institution, they pray in a parking lot. They do not have a university religious center. Or they pray wherever they can. They pop into an office or they find a quiet place in a library. And what does it mean that we can't even create spaces for our students to do something they do daily, right? And so there are some big differences. I'm not underneath sort of the student life or student affairs umbrella. I'm separate, which most institutions like to keep religion separate, which makes sense to me. But when you get to a public institution, they try to designate at least half a job description to equity issues around religion. And that's not enough. That's not enough to care for the great variety of religious expression on your campuses. And so UCLA, I'll use it as example again, they have a bunch of affiliate groups. I'm unaware of a secular affiliate amongst those. Because there's no religious life office at UCLA, then it's all just affiliates. And so they're trying to support existing groups. And so if you don't have anyone there who can help cultivate a secular community, then there's not going to be a secular community there, right? And so I would say amongst public institutions, it's probably harder to cultivate secular communities that are intentional.
I see two hands online, but let's go. Vincent, you next?
Maybe we'll do Vincent and then somebody online and then.
Great, very good.
Do you folks ever hear of the Secular Therapy Project or Recovering from Religion?
I've heard of recovering from religion, maybe less so the secular therapies, if you want to share a bit.
It's pretty simple. It is a outsourcing place where people can meet. Outsourcing might not be the right word. A referral place where people can find a therapist who's not going to tell them to get right with Jesus as a part of their therapy program. And that pretty much sums it up. You know, you can find a therapist who shares values with you and won't tell you that stuff. Seculartherapyproject.org.
Thank you. And that reminds me, because in my University Religious Center, we also have Alcoholics Anonymous that meets every single night. And we know there's also secular options in that particular recovery area as well. So yeah, it's nice to have these available to students.
Thank you. I saw Moji's hand first on.
The queue actually is Tom, Moji, and then Rebecca.
Oh, thank you so much, Pat. I appreciate that.
Okay, I'm next up. Okay, great. Really appreciate the work that you're doing, and Ann and I are both active in the American Ethical Union, and she and I and Bandra will have a conversation about how we can go ahead and support clergy development to try to replicate the kind of work that you're doing. So I'm very interested in religious history and analytics. So, for example, I'm a regular listener to Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus podcast and a regular reader of Ryan Berge's graphs about religion. And then on the fun side, I'm a big fan of Book of Mormon. And I was wondering, in the current environment, is it still a safe space to talk about religious criticism and analytics of this sort, or is this also now a minefield that you have to be aware of as things decline in this country?
Yeah, well, was it on Friday? We saw another, I don't know, memo about creating, what's the name going to be? A faith office, but here,
Bias against Christianity. Because there's bias against Christianity, right?
right,
Yeah.
right. And so the
Right.
concern about
Forget about Christian hegemony.
anti-Christian bias, and as you heard from probably a variety of people, with Christian dominance in the US, there's Christian privilege, Christian supremacy, Christian all sorts of things. And so you're right. Being critical of Christianity could be perceived as being anti-Christian. And so you probably should be careful what kind of words you use. And especially me in my role, I probably should be careful. And I think folks who know me know that I'm not criticizing Christianity, but what I am looking for in our institutions is equity and care for everyone in a way that hasn't been done well in the past. And so I'm just striving for us to do better. But you're right. A lot of us, could be in danger because what we're saying can be perceived as anti-Christian bias.
But just one concrete follow-up. So, for example, in your list of resources or your website, do you feel like you're able to list, Bart Ehrman and Misquoting Jesus, or list Ryan Berge as resources people can look at, or is that assumed in our wonderful new world that those are biased?
I guess I'm just taking a practical approach. My website isn't that useful. It gets students connected to program sort of things, but we don't necessarily, because we're not a educating sort of department, we're not an academic department, I have less those resources. Most of the resources I have are to connect with secular communities or connect with whatever community you're looking for. And then within those groups, I imagine you can do all sorts of stuff if it's not being recorded and documented in that way. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Now we're going to go back in-house for a question.
Should we do emoji
Okay.
and then?
Oh, okay, great. Pat, you have the list. So who's next?
It would be Moji and then Rebecca after Moji.
Thank you. Go ahead, Moji.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and I enjoyed the talk. I am, in terms of my background, I'm an Iranian American Sufi Muslim, and my education, and then before I retired, was in humanistic psychology. And so there are two things that I am noting. That is, the term secular is being used as synonymous to atheist. In Iran, I have a in absentia execution order by the Circuit Number 15 of the so-called Revolutionary Court in Iran. And you know what my crime is for which they threaten to kill me? Even here, warring against God. So in terms of religious persecution, I guess I have a PhD. I'm joking. But there was another person in the Islamic history 1100 years ago, Mansur Hallaj, the famous Sufi. He said, I am God, I am the truth. And he was hung back then, which is why we know of who he was. My thinking is, at one level, I feel whenever things get tough, counselors and spiritual guides or whatever, they at the end, the toughest issues are referred to the poor psychologist or a poor mental health professional. And I have been there. And so I'm saying that there are issues that are so intersectional, interconnected, that cause a plethora of issues and symptoms that then a lot of people who are lucky enough, privileged enough to be able to just say, okay, we'll do just a few sessions, and then we refer this to that poor person who is called a mental health professional, and they are supposed to take care of it somehow. I just wanted to, first of all, I thank you for your beautiful talk. You are from the global South, like I am, so we are not privileged and we have experienced colonialism. But I just wanted to throw these two issues at, for your comment. One is using the word secular as synonymous to atheists harms people inside Iran who are trying to create a secular governance where religion and governance or dictatorship are separate from each other. That's one. The other one is, what about the poor psychologist or psychiatrist or the mental health professional that is thrown the toughest issues, and then he or she has to deal with a person who has been harmed by so many different factors in society, culminating in mental health symptoms. Thank you. I'm in Boulder, Colorado, by the way.
Oh, amazing. Thank you, Moji. And yeah, I thank you for that commentary on the word secularism. I think because I'm in higher education, and as you heard when I started, we use this term RSSI, and that word secular is like the umbrella term for atheist, humanist, agnostic, like all those things. And we know language is not perfect, right? And absolutely the word secular, it matters what context in which you are using it as well, with your example of Iran. And so thank you for pointing that out, because it's true. There were probably a couple of times today that I equated it with my atheism, but in the workplace, I would use it more broadly. And then in terms of, well, therapists, I think all of our fields are evolving all the time, and I think intersectionality is something that we're getting better at showing how things are interconnected too, and how they impact the person. And so I'm not a therapist. I do, as a person who has these experiences from the global South, am able to see things in a certain light, I think, differently. And so it really does require our therapists, our psychologists, and so forth to be trained in a way to really see those connections. And we know even the field of psychology is limited. There's only so much you can do for the individual who is being impacted by the systems, the structural violences, and everything else, right? And so the psychologist is dealing with the individual in that moment and how they can best deal with all those factors. So, I mean, it's a good field, and yeah, ever evolving.
It has its limitations, doesn't it? Rebecca, I believe you're next. You're muted, Rebecca.
I've unmuted you, Rebecca. You can speak now.
Oh, thank you. It's so hard on a phone to find that. Thank you so much. What a great talk. And we could do this for hours. I am an adjunct faculty at the City University of New York, very active in different ways, and witnessed what was happening on your campus in response to the student occupations, or I forget what we call them, but in response to the U.S. Involvement in Palestine. And very concerned with the level of repression that's coming our way that you witnessed and experienced on your campus. And so curious how humanists we might respond to all the repression that has been happening, is going to keep happening at this time. Particularly from a campus life, but not only at all, because I think this will spill into all different ways that we try to respond to the government's current action. So how we respond to repression as humanists, maybe to summarize my thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would say that the students in my secular student fellowship are some of the most politically engaged students that I know on campus. Some of them are studying international relations. Some of them are just training to be accountants or otherwise. But like you and I, we want to be of use in this world, in this time, and in service to each other. And I see that showing up. And so I do know students who were out in those protests. I do know students and staff who were arrested on campus. They're putting themselves out there and really laying down for their beliefs and their values. And I imagine not every humanist, agnostic, and atheist student was out protesting, the same for faculty and staff, but that they may find ways to advocate for their beliefs in other ways, on college campuses or in their city, and how they vote, and all of this. And so I think that's the beauty of activism, is that we can all do it in the ways that we feel called to do it. And for young adults, protest and service actually are very common.
Thank you. I think that was everyone
There
on
was
Zoom, so
someone here
who's
as
here?
well. Hannah, were you one of them?
I did have my hand up, but and this is such a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we could go on all afternoon. But in the interest of time, I'm going to pass it over to Michaeline, who also had her hand up.
No, my question got answered.
Okay, we do have time, it's okay.
That was such an awesome presentation. I think we could all listen to you for hours. You're not only are you at a place where there's sort of a climax around the anti-genocide, protests. You're also within the sort of ring of the fires, and I'm guessing that the generation of folks who you're dealing with have a lot of anxiety around climate and whether they will have a future. I'm wondering if that is also part of what you're dealing with as sort of like in your kind of counseling. And what do you tell people who are coming to you saying, I don't know what's going to happen?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, a couple years ago, USC, one of our affiliates, started deeming themselves an eco-chaplain because they were absolutely concerned with how we are treating our planet and how that connects with our spiritual health. And so the great thing is that the president of USC, when she came in 6 years ago, she was all about sustainability. One of the first things she did was she put solar panels on top of the Galen Center, which is our basketball stadium. And that was just one act. She's done so many things on our campus for sustainability purposes that, truth be told, in LA, people really could care less about composting and all these things, but she put all that stuff into place. But in terms of the students, yes, there is so much anxiety of a variety of anxieties, but this one is very real for them. And so what our eco-chaplain tried to do is cultivate ways that they could deal with that fear of the unknown, of like, is this planet going to be here for us and future generations, and to sort of tangibly engage with that by doing things, whether it's service, but also planting, being connected with the earth, facilitating some sort of rituals to just speak to the anxiety. And the truth is, we don't know. We don't know what the future holds, but there's small steps we can take to feel better about it, but also bigger steps we can take as a collective to ensure our planet's future. And so I love the idea of an eco-chaplain because we're all in it, right? We are. And so that is a form of care as well.
Eco-chaplain, I love it. Okay. I see, Moji, you have your hand up again. Do you have a question?
Hi, it's not a question. A few years ago, I came up with the idea of ecological or climate anxiety syndrome, which is not recognized by the American Psychiatric Association. However, I experience it personally as a intersectional activist, and but also I've seen it, especially in younger people. There is a certain kind of anxiety that is different than the regular kind of adolescent or early adulthood anxiety that young people experience. And so I just wanted to throw that term, ecological / climate anxiety syndrome. And I hope it doesn't pathologizes it, but it is something to be recognized, that we are dealing with something that is so horrendous called climate change and environmental collapse that we need to pay attention to, which is, just very quickly, I put in the chat the link to Chambers of Compassion or intersectional circles, which I am behind and is supported by Noam Chomsky and others. So I've put it in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you for that and that new terminology we're learning today. It actually reminded me of one more example I wanted to offer. There's an organization called Interfaith Power and Light. I think they have chapters throughout the nation. Our eco-chaplain ended up becoming the director of the Southern California chapter. And so one thing she did before she left was we did an interfaith pilgrimage to the LA River, which if you've been to LA, it doesn't feel like much of a river, right? It's that empty canal with a drip of water going down. And so she created different rituals, but also a service day for the students to go, to walk, to clean up, but also learn the history of waterways in our region, and ways in which, different researchers or technologies are going to be of service of having clean water in the future, right? And so grounding yourself in the history of the lands, but also coming up with tangible ways to improve in the future. And so these are things you can do.
Thank you so much. Let's thank Vanessa for joining us today.